Sometimes there'd be a scene in the Andy Griffith Show where Opie was getting away with something. I sort of remember asking him, geez, would that work for me?
What if we told you that the Andy Griffith Show, one of television's most wholesome treasures, was hiding some of its darkest secrets just out of sight? The series looked like innocence itself, but what young Ron Howard discovered behind the cameras was a very different reality. Why did the cast both adore and quietly fear Andy Griffith? And what moments did Ron witness on that set that still echo in his memory to this day? Ron went from a 6-year-old boy on set to an Oscar-winning director, but the experiences he carried from that world will make you question everything you thought you knew about Hollywood. A boy named Opie. The Andy Griffith Show changed Ron Howard's life forever. At just 6 years old, he stepped into a role that not only made him a household name but also shaped the person he would become. To most viewers, Opie Taylor was simply the sheriff's adorable son, the perfect counterbalance to Andy Griffith's calm presence. But how Ron ended up in that role and what the show became was a much bigger story than anyone realized at the time. The series itself began in October 1960. Television audiences had plenty of sitcoms to choose from, but this one felt different right away. While other shows chased modern trends, the Andy Griffith Show slowed everything down. It took people to Mayberry, a small fictional town that looked and felt like rural America in the 1930s. Neighbors knew each other, doors were always open, and problems were solved with patience and wit instead of drama. For viewers in the middle of a rapidly changing decade, it was both comforting and nostalgic. But Mayberry's roots were a little unusual. The idea for the show came from a guest appearance on The Danny Thomas Show. In that single episode, Andy Griffith appeared as a small-town sheriff. It was meant to be a one-off role, but producers saw something in him. That short performance became the seed that grew into a full series, one that would last 8 seasons and go down as one of the most beloved sitcoms of all time. And right in the middle of it was Ron Howard. Landing the part of Opie didn't happen by accident. Before Mayberry, Ron had a tiny, uncredited role on General Electric Theater. Most people wouldn't have noticed it. But the host of that program, Ronald Reagan, did. He mentioned Ron by name on air, which caught the attention of producer Sheldon Leonard. Leonard had an instinct for talent, and he remembered Ron's face. At the time, Ron was already signed onto another series at Mr. O'Malley. Many thought that would be his big break, but Leonard didn't believe in it. He said the show would fail, and he was right. Mr. O'Malley collapsed quickly. This left Ron free, and when casting began for the Andy Griffith Show, he was available. That's how Opie Taylor was born. Stepping onto the set as a child could have been intimidating, but Andy Griffith made it easier. From the beginning, Andy treated Ron with kindness and respect. He didn't talk down to him or treat him as just a kid. Instead, he spoke to him as an equal, with patience and warmth. For a 6-year-old, this mattered. It gave Ron the confidence to believe he belonged there. But there was another influence working behind the scenes, and it was Rance Howard, Ron's father. He knew the industry well enough to worry about how his son's role might be handled. Early on, he gave Andy a note suggesting that Opie should be treated like a real person, not just as comic relief or background. Andy took the advice seriously. He made sure the scripts reflected that. As a result, the relationship between Andy and Opie became the emotional core of the show. It wasn't just funny or sweet, it felt real. Fathers and sons at home could see themselves in those moments, and viewers connected with it deeply. Of course, Mayberry wasn't built on just Andy and Opie. The cast came together in a way that gave the town its heart. Don Knotts played the bumbling deputy Barney Fife, turning clumsiness into comedy gold and winning 5 Emmy Awards along the way. Frances Bavier became Aunt Bee, the no-nonsense but loving matriarch of the Taylor household, earning her own Emmy for the role. And together with other familiar townsfolk, they built a place that felt alive. The audience loved it. Week after week, the show pulled in big numbers. In fact, across its entire run, the Andy Griffith Show never ranked lower than 7th in the Nielsen ratings. And when it ended in 1968, it did something almost unheard of. It went out at number 1. Very few series in television history can claim the same, but the impact didn't stop with ratings. The show became part of American culture. Reruns have been running for decades, and new generations still discover it. In Andy Griffith's hometown of Mount Airy, North Carolina, Fans gather every year for Mayberry Days, a festival that celebrates the world the show created. It's proof that even more than half a century later, Mayberry still holds a special place in people's hearts. For Ron Howard, though, Mayberry wasn't just a place for fans. It was his childhood. Playing Opie gave him lessons that went beyond memorizing lines. It showed him what respect on a set looked like. It gave him confidence. And it gave him a foundation that would eventually guide him into directing. But even as the show gave him a childhood most kids could never imagine, it also came with challenges. While the world remembers Opie Taylor as a wide-eyed boy growing up under the steady hand of Sheriff Andy Taylor, Ron Howard himself remembers much more. The truth about what unfolded behind the cameras would follow him for decades, shaping not only his memories of childhood but also his understanding of the entertainment industry. The drama behind the scenes. On screen, the Andy Griffith Show looked like the definition of harmony. A gentle sheriff, a sweet little boy, a quirky deputy, and neighbors who, even when they argued, always found their way back to kindness. Mayberry seemed like the perfect small town, but behind the cameras, things weren't always as simple. In fact, the truth of what was happening on set sometimes looked very different from the world fans saw on TV. One of the first challenges was the sheer pace of production. In today's world, a sitcom season might have 10 or 12 episodes. Back in the 1960s, it was more than double that. The Andy Griffith Show produced over 30 episodes every season, which meant long days, tight schedules, and very little breathing room. For the actors, that pressure added up. And for Andy Griffith, who was not only the star but also a creative force on the show, it took a toll. Griffith was known for his perfectionism. He wanted every line, every scene, and every detail to land exactly right. That drive made the show great, but it also created tension. Cast and crew members sometimes described him as having two very different sides. On one hand, he could be warm, funny, and deeply supportive. On the other hand, he had a reputation for being moody and volatile, especially when drunk. These moods could spill onto the set, creating a very different atmosphere than the lighthearted one audiences saw on screen. But Andy wasn't the only one carrying private struggles. Don Knotts, who played Deputy Barney Fife, became beloved for his clumsy, anxious, and endlessly funny character. But off-screen, Don carried the weight of a painful past. He grew up in a difficult household marked by poverty and instability, and those early years left scars that never fully healed. Even as he collected Emmy Awards and made America laugh, he privately wrestled with insecurities and personal demons that haunted him throughout his life. Knotts' relationship with Griffith was complicated too. For the first 5 seasons, the two men worked side by side, building one of television's greatest comedy duos. But when Knotts left after season 5, the reasons were layered. On the surface, it was about career. He had signed a film contract with Universal, believing the show would end after its 5th season. When Griffith decided to continue, Knotts was already committed elsewhere. But underneath, there were other tensions. The Emmy Awards that Knotts kept winning reportedly stirred feelings of rivalry. Insider reports revealed that creative differences and personal jealousy occasionally bubbled up, and for a time their friendship cooled. But over the years, they eventually found their way back to each other, reconciling and rebuilding the bond that began in Mayberry. Frances Bavier, who played Aunt Bee, also added another layer of complexity. On screen, she was the dependable heart of the Taylor household, stubborn at times, but ultimately warm and nurturing. Off-screen, though, she was known to be more complicated. She clashed with some of her castmates and carried a reputation for being difficult to work with. Some said she held grudges. Others believed she resented Griffith himself, though the reasons were never completely clear. In her later years, Bavier became increasingly isolated, retreating from Hollywood, and even from close connections with her fellow actors. There were also some scandalous personal choices that deeply impacted the show itself. For instance, Andy Griffith reportedly had a long-running affair with Annetta Corsott, who played schoolteacher Helen Crump. Their relationship was an open secret among the cast and crew. While it didn't explode publicly at the time, it created an undercurrent on set that some felt was hard to ignore. And then there was the bigger picture. Mayberry was built to feel timeless and safe, but the 1960s were anything but that. As America wrestled with civil rights, social change, and cultural upheaval, The Andy Griffith Show chose a different path. It presented a sanitized version of Southern life, where race and politics were almost never addressed. For audiences at the time, that made the show a welcome escape. But to others, it highlighted the gap between the Mayberry fantasy and the realities of American life. The show's choice to avoid those tensions kept it popular, but it also meant the world outside Mayberry sometimes felt like it was being left out of the story. The Andy Griffith Show's set was full of human contradictions, perfectionism, temper, rivalry, friendship, and conflict. And Ron Howard quickly learned that behind every perfect picture show lay hidden struggles that could never be fully erased. But the deepest scars of the Andy Griffith Show were yet to reveal themselves. Because behind the laughter, the lessons, and the glow of one of television's most beloved shows, there were tragedies, personal losses, illnesses, and heartbreaks that Mayberry itself could never soften. The tragedies the show hid. For all the laughter and lighthearted charm of the Andy Griffith Show, there were darker threads running quietly in the background. The show gave America a picture of small-town joy, but behind that image were struggles, heartbreaks, and, over time, the loss of some of its most beloved faces. One of the earliest and most visible tragedies came with Howard McNear, the man fans knew as Floyd the Barber. Floyd was more than a character. He was the gentle presence in the barbershop, always ready with a story, a chuckle, or a kind word. But in 1963, during the height of the show's success, McNear suffered a devastating stroke that left the entire cast shaken. For many actors, that kind of blow would have ended their careers. But McNear, with remarkable determination, came back. The production team adjusted to his condition, sometimes seating him in chairs or supporting him physically so he could continue his role. Audiences barely noticed, and that was the point. It was an act of quiet bravery, a reminder that even in Mayberry, real people faced very real challenges. But not every struggle had a chance at recovery. Joanna Moore, who played Peggy, Andy's girlfriend during the early seasons, faced battles that never fully left her. Behind the camera, she struggled with addiction, first to alcohol, then to illicit substances. Hollywood in the 1960s was not always a kind place for women, and Moore's personal demons only grew stronger over time. Though she continued to work in television and film, her career slowly unraveled. Her daughter, Tatum O'Neal, would later become the youngest person ever to win an Academy Award. But her childhood was marked by her mother's turmoil. Joanna's story became one of the show's hidden heartbreaks, and a reminder that even those who seem to have everything could be fighting silent battles. The years after Mayberry also brought inevitable loss. Don Knotts, the brilliant, jittery Barney Fife, gave the world one of television's most unforgettable characters. But in 2006, he passed away at the age of 81. His death hit fans hard. For decades, Knotts had been the heart of comedy, not just on The Andy Griffith Show, but in films and TV that followed, and his passing felt like the loss of a piece of childhood itself. Frances Bavier, Aunt Bee to millions, also left behind a complicated legacy. She retired in North Carolina, far from Hollywood, living in solitude. When she passed away in 1989, fans mourned her as the steady, nurturing figure of Mayberry. But those who knew her remembered a more complex woman, who struggled with relationships and sometimes found herself at odds with those closest to her on the set. George Lindsay, who played Goober, kept the Mayberry spirit alive long after the cameras stopped rolling. He was a regular at fan festivals and conventions, always embracing the legacy that had defined him. And when he passed in 2012, it felt like another link to that golden era had been broken. For Ron Howard, growing up surrounded by these people meant that their losses carried an even deeper weight. These weren't just co-workers, they were mentors, role models, and, in many ways, a second family. Ron has spoken often about how much Don Knotts meant to him, not just as a comedian, but as a kind, steady presence during his childhood. The same was true of Andy Griffith, whose influence stayed with Ron long after Mayberry ended. Being so young on the show had shielded Ron from much of the behind-the-scenes turmoil. Yet, as he grew older and looked back, the struggles and tragedies of his castmates became clearer. The town of Mayberry had been built to be timeless, untouched by the turmoil of the outside world. But for the men and women who brought it to life, time was inescapable. Health declined, demons resurfaced, and struggles worsened. What endured was the memory of their work, the laughter, the wisdom, and the quiet lessons woven into each episode. The Andy Griffith Show gave Ron his career, his foundation, and his earliest mentors, but it also taught him that nothing lasts forever, not even the world's most perfect small town. It was this realization that made the final day of filming one of the most emotional moments in the lives of everyone involved. A day when the cast knew they were saying goodbye, not only to a television series, but also to a world they could never truly return to. The final day. By the spring of 1968, The Andy Griffith Show had become something more than just a television series. For nearly a decade, it had been a ritual in living rooms across America. Families gathered each week to step into Mayberry, if only for 30 minutes, and escape into its warmth. But even the most beloved stories must eventually end. The final day of filming carried a weight everyone on set could feel. There was laughter, but it was mixed with something heavier, a sense that they weren't just finishing an episode, they were closing a chapter of their lives. At the wrap party, Andy Griffith did something he didn't often do. He stopped, stood before his cast and crew, and gave a farewell speech. Andy was known for his warmth, but also for keeping his emotions guarded. Yet that day, his voice carried both pride and sadness. He thanked his colleagues for bringing Mayberry to life. He thanked them for their patience, their friendship, and for making something that would last long after the cameras stopped rolling. He reminded them that while the show was ending, the bonds they had formed didn't have to. For the younger cast, those words hit especially hard. Ron Howard, only 14 at the time, couldn't contain himself. He had grown up on that set. From a 6-year-old boy playing Opie Taylor to a teenager on the cusp of his own future, Mayberry had been his second home. The people there weren't just co-workers, they were family. And when the reality of leaving that family sank in, Ron broke down in tears. Speaking about the experience, he said, "I suddenly didn't know what it was going to be like to not have that show in my future and those people in my future." The truth is, Mayberry wasn't just a set. It had been a world carefully built over 8 years, and everyone who worked there had invested a piece of themselves into it. Don Knotts, though he had left the show earlier, returned for the wrap and shared in the nostalgia. Everyone from the crew to camera operators, set designers, and script supervisors understood that they had been part of something that went beyond ratings or awards. They had created a slice of Americana that generations would cling to, and it wasn't lost on anyone that the timing was symbolic. 1968 was a turbulent year in America, filled with civil rights struggles, the Vietnam War, and political tensions. Against that backdrop, the curtain coming down on The Andy Griffith Show felt like the symbolic end of a more innocent vision of the country. Mayberry represented a simpler, kinder world, and with its departure, television itself seemed to be shifting into something new. For Ron Howard, however, the ending was also a beginning. While leaving Opie behind was painful, he soon found himself stepping into another iconic role, Richie Cunningham on Happy Days. That show would define the 1970s just as The Andy Griffith Show had defined the 1960s. But Ron's ambitions didn't stop with acting. By the 80s and 90s, he had transitioned into directing, building a career that few child stars could have ever imagined. And yet, through all of it, he has never forgotten the show that made him. In interviews, Ron often credits The Andy Griffith Show with shaping not only his career, but also his character. Watching Andy Griffith lead a set taught him lessons in leadership he still uses as a director. He learned empathy by observing the way Andy treated people, how he respected crew members, listened to suggestions, and always tried to bring out the best in those around him. He also learned discipline. Week after week, the show demanded long hours and professionalism, even from a child actor, and Ron absorbed those lessons and carried them with him into adulthood. More than anything, Ron Howard learned the power of storytelling. The show didn't rely on flash or spectacle. It relied on people. It showed that even small, everyday struggles could be meaningful when told with honesty and heart. And that belief has been at the core of Ron Howard's work ever since. And yet, for all the good, Ron Howard also carried with him a perspective on the darker truths that the show had hidden. While The Andy Griffith Show seemed like the perfect representation of innocence on screen, behind the scenes, Ron Howard witnessed some shocking incidents that forever altered his perspective on the entertainment industry. The sad truth about the Andy Griffith Show. On television, the Andy Griffith Show looked like the purest slice of American life. It felt calm, safe, and filled with gentle lessons about kindness and community. It was a show where kids respected their parents, neighbors stopped to chat on the front porch, and the biggest problem of the week might be an apple pie contest gone wrong. But behind those bright smiles and gentle storylines, the reality was much different, especially for one little boy, Ron Howard. In his memoir, The Boys, Ron gave fans a glimpse into what life was really like behind the scenes. And let's just say, Mayberry wasn't nearly as wholesome once the cameras stopped rolling. Ron was exposed to adult behaviors, harsh realities, and experiences that left lasting impressions. The first and most jarring reality came from the crew members themselves. Television in the 1960s was a high-pressure environment, and the culture on set reflected that. According to Ron, the men who operated the cameras, handled the equipment, and kept production moving were a far cry from the gentle townsfolk of Mayberry. They frequently used vulgar language, often shouting or joking crudely even when children were present. Alcohol was also common on the lot. And Ron recalled that some crew members indulged heavily even by midday, which added to the sense of unpredictability around him. And then there were the bathrooms. On screen, the show looked like the kind of place where everyone left their doors unlocked. But off-screen, the studio restrooms were anything but innocent. Ron recalled that they were plastered with crude, explicit graffiti images and words he didn't even understand as a boy. It was his father, Rance Howard, who eventually had to sit him down and explain what some of it meant. Another constant presence was smoking. Ron revealed that cigarettes were everywhere on set, in dressing rooms, and during rehearsals. It was so bad that Ron recalled his eyes burning from the haze of smoke that seemed to hang over every room. Today, the dangers of smoking are widely recognized, but at the time, it was simply part of the culture. But the hardest thing for Ron wasn't the smoke or even the graffiti. It was the way people treated others, and sometimes the way they treated him. One of the memories that stayed with him was hearing inappropriate slurs directed at Jim Neighbors, who played the lovable Gomer Pyle. Neighbors wasn't openly out at the time, and while most of America saw him as the sweet, bumbling mechanic, behind the scenes he endured cruel jokes and whispers that Ron, even as a child, knew were hurtful. Ron himself wasn't immune to cruelty either. While the show made him famous, it also made him a target. At school, kids teased him relentlessly, mocking the very role that millions adored. Things got so bad that one time Ron wet his pants rather than risk using the bathroom, where he feared more ridicule. Fame for him was not a shield but an extra burden, one that separated him from other children and made him feel isolated. But that's not all. On set, he was also exposed to the raw edges of adult conversations. Ron recalled overhearing Andy Griffith and Don Knotts discussing marital problems in therapy sessions, conversations that went far over his head at the time, but still left impressions. They were private matters not meant for a child's ears, but the proximity of the young actor to his adult co-stars meant that he absorbed more than anyone realized. He learned early that the people who seemed perfect on television were often struggling in their own personal lives. Some of those struggles were visible. Ron remembered one moment vividly: Andy Griffith returning from a holiday break with his hand bandaged, openly admitting that he had punched a door in a drunken rage. The image was startling for Ron, who idolized Griffith as both a mentor and father figure. Yet even as he learned of these flaws, Ron never turned against Griffith. He remained careful in his reflections, acknowledging the darker side of what he witnessed without undermining the man's influence on his life. In fact, Ron consistently described Andy Griffith in deeply positive terms. For all the volatility and imperfections, Griffith gave Ron guidance that shaped his career. He treated him like a professional, respected his abilities, and set a standard of discipline that Ron would carry into his directing career. Griffith's influence, despite everything, remained foundational. There were also creative frustrations that Griffith himself could never fully shake. Ron revealed that Griffith was always annoyed that television critics did not embrace the show's emotional depth, especially by the time the series reached its 5th season. Griffith had envisioned the show as more than light comedy. He wanted it to reflect character, warmth, and honesty. But when critics dismissed it as simple or too nostalgic, he bristled at the lack of recognition. Part of Griffith's creative identity was his dislike for slapstick comedy. He felt that the humor of the South was naturally rich, and he was quick to cut any jokes he felt were too broad or cartoonish. He constantly reminded writers and producers that the heart of the show lay in its authenticity, not in cheap laughs. It was this instinct that gave the show its timeless quality, but it also highlighted the tension between Griffith's high standards and the industry's expectations. For Ron Howard, all of these contradictions between the wholesome surface and the messy reality were part of his education. There was no escaping the tension between the show's perfect image and reality. And perhaps that is why the Andy Griffith Show continues to resonate. It was never entirely about perfection. It was about longing for it. But what do you think? Was Ron Howard too young to experience the things he did on the set of the Andy Griffith Show? Drop your answers in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click on the next video on your screen, like this video, and subscribe to our channel for more updates.